No one saw him. No one saw him in distress. No, that's the part about
I agree.
it that that's the only thing I can't grasp.
I completely agree. But that also doesn't point the finger at the friends, right?
100%. There's one overarching question I've had for weeks now. Do you think that if there are no criminal charges from the grand jury, if the autopsy from the state shows this was an accidental drowning, is that going to be the end of the story? Or do you think that people out there, maybe even the family, will not accept that?
No way it's going to be the end of the story, because as you know, Jesse, medical
always says when he concludes a case, as he concludes a story, we shall see. We shall see. So, Dan, thank you for taking the time. That was a really, I thought that interview that you did on your show was fantastic and very illuminating. So, Dan Abrams, SiriusXM, POTUS Channel 124, On Patrol Live. Dan's got a million things going on. I appreciate you taking the time.
Jesse, the man who has almost now as many things going on as me, which is great.
2 court cases are moving on Nolan Wells right now. Only one of them is about how he died. That's the part almost nobody watching this is expecting, because for over a month, no updates has been the headline on the actual death investigation. But while that case sits sealed, waiting on a grand jury, a completely separate federal case has been racing forward, with actual arrests, actual court dates, and a paper trail investigators can point to. It's just not about Nolan. It's about what happened to the people around him after he died. Let's start with what sealed really means here, because it's doing a lot of work in this story. Nolan Wells was 18, from Ocean Springs, Mississippi. He went missing July 4th after an Independence Day gathering on Horn Island, a barrier island off the Gulf Coast that's popular for exactly this kind of holiday trip. His body was found on the shoreline 2 days later. From the start, local authorities said they saw no initial signs of foul play, but no signs of foul play is not the same as case closed. Attorney Ben Crump, who's representing the Wells family independently of the official investigation, has said the autopsy came back listing the cause and manner of death as undetermined. No fractures, no deep tissue injuries. That result raises more questions than it answers, and it's part of why the case hasn't gone away. Here's the part that actually explains the silence, though. The district attorney overseeing the investigation said last month that every piece of evidence collected so far will stay sealed until it's presented to a grand jury. That's a legal decision, not a stall tactic, but it does mean that, from the public side, this case can look frozen even while things are happening behind the scenes. No one has been arrested. No one has been named a suspect. That part of the story genuinely hasn't moved. What has moved, fast, is a different case entirely. As speculation about Wells's death exploded online, so did threats against people connected to the investigation, and federal prosecutors have now charged 3 separate people for it. The first is Michelle Francine Edwards, from Ohio, accused of placing a bomb threat against the George County Chancery Clerk's office on July 23rd, then calling the Jackson County Sheriff's Office with a second bomb threat that same day. Court documents say she called the Chancery Clerk more than 20 times in 8 minutes, telling them not to go outside, that the clock was ticking. None of that is speculation. It's laid out in a probable cause affidavit. The second and third defendants were charged in the days that followed, culminating at the end of July with the case that's actually driving this update. Edward James Porter, of Berwyn, Illinois. Here's what's genuinely strange about all 3 of these people. None of them appear to know Nolan Wells, his family, or the group of friends who were on that boat. They're not witnesses. They're not suspects in the death. They inserted themselves into a case they had no connection to, and now they're the ones facing federal charges. So how do you catch someone who threatens a stranger over the phone from 1,000 miles away? This is where the investigation actually gets interesting. According to the federal criminal complaint, Porter allegedly called one witness repeatedly on July 31st, threatening to kill them and their family, and telling them he already had their home address. He allegedly called a second witness and threatened to kill that person, everyone in their home, and any police officers who happened to be present. One outlet reported he went even further, describing what he said he'd do to the body. Investigators didn't get to Porter through a tip. They got there through subpoenas served on Boost Mobile, tracing the phone numbers and IP addresses used to make those calls. a trail that led straight back to an apartment building in Berwyn. When federal agents and Berwyn police showed up to arrest him, according to records obtained by NBC5 Investigates, he didn't resist. That digital trail is also why this case escalated the way it did. A federal judge in Mississippi didn't just charge Porter. The judge granted prosecutors' request to stay an order that had initially set bond and ordered him transferred to Mississippi. He's now being held for a custody hearing scheduled for September 2nd. Now here's the detail that actually reframes the whole story, and it's the reason this case matters beyond one angry phone call. The witnesses Porter threatened weren't random. Attorney Russell Latino, who represents the family of Bart Edmiston Jr., says his client was on Horn Island hours before Wells disappeared, and that two of the people Porter threatened are members of Edmiston's family, including one who's an actual witness in the death investigation. Edmiston hasn't been named a suspect. He's a 21-year-old who, according to Latino, helped provide aid to the boat the group used that day. But online, unverified theories about who was where and what happened that night turned into a real address, a real phone call, and a real threat to kill an entire family, including any police who showed up. That's the mechanism worth sitting with. This isn't a story about official investigators closing in on someone. It's a story about the internet's version of the investigation doing real damage to people who, as far as the public record shows, did nothing but happen to be nearby. And if you want to understand exactly how that vacuum got filled, you only need to look at one small detail that somehow became its own controversy: what Nolan Wells was wearing when he was found. Early on, Todd Terrell, president of the volunteer search group United Cajun Navy, told a national television host that Wells was found face down and fully clothed. Attorney Ben Crump picked up on that detail publicly, pointing out that it didn't match photos from earlier that day showing Wells shirtless and in swim trunks. It became a flashpoint. If he was fully clothed, why, and what did that mean for how he ended up in the water? Then the Cajun Navy walked it back. Terrell told a local paper he'd simply agreed with the interviewer's phrasing without correcting it, and that Wells was actually found wearing only his blue swim trunks, clothed, in the sense of not being naked, but not fully clothed in the way most people would picture it. The group later put out a statement accusing Crump of misrepresenting what they'd told him. Crump responded that he stood by his goal of finding the truth, whoever it implicated or cleared. Neither side, notably, has disputed the more clinical finding buried in that same reporting. An independent review of the autopsy noted an area of red discoloration on the back of Wells's head, though the medical examiner said decomposition made it impossible to reach a definitive conclusion about whether that indicated any kind of trauma. That's not a smoking gun. It's exactly the kind of ambiguous finding that, paired with an undetermined cause of death, keeps every theory technically alive at once. The local sheriff, for his part, said early on that he suspected drowning, noting the area is known for strong currents. That's a real, grounded theory, not a dismissal. But it's also just one working theory among several. Among several, the sealed evidence file is presumably still weighing. Layer onto that a separate detail. TMZ reported in late July, citing unnamed sources, that evidence suggested Wells may have still been on Horn Island after the boat carrying his friends had already left. If accurate, that would extend the window of what actually happened after his friends say they lost track of him. But it's attributed to unnamed sources in a single outlet's reporting, not to an official statement, and it hasn't been confirmed by investigators. That's three separate, unresolved threads: the clothing dispute, the head discoloration note, and the timeline question about when Wells was actually last on the island, all sitting inside a case where the only official evidence is locked away until a grand jury sees it. Each one is easy to build a theory around. None of them, on their own, proves anything, and that gap between plausible detail and proven fact is exactly where the threats against witnesses came from. That pressure hasn't just come from strangers online. It's also drawn in some very public names. Actor Tyler Perry and civil rights leader Reverend Al Sharpton each pledged $50,000 for information leading to an arrest in Wells's death, announced alongside the family at his funeral. Former NFL wide receiver Terrell Owens added another $25,000. On the other side, Benjamin Hudson, father of the friend Wells reportedly considered his best friend, started a fundraiser to cover legal costs for the group of friends he says have been targeted since Wells died. As of the most recent reporting, it's raised close to its $100,000 goal. So you've got reward money pushing for answers on one side, and legal defense funds protecting people from threats on the other, both existing because one case is sealed and silent, and the vacuum it left got filled with speculation. It's worth pausing on why that vacuum filled the way it did in the first place. Wells was black. The group of high school friends he traveled to Horn Island with were white. Multiple outlets covering this case have pointed to that dynamic, combined with Mississippi's documented history of racial violence and a general public distrust of how these investigations get handled, as part of what turned a tragic drowning or something worse into a national flashpoint within days. Now President Derek Johnson has publicly criticized how local law enforcement has handled the case. None of that proves anything about what happened to Wells specifically, but it does explain why this case generated the kind of attention that produces $50,000 reward offers and federal threat prosecutions instead of staying a local Mississippi coast story. It's also worth being honest about what a federal witness intimidation charge actually means for Porter's case going forward, since that's a different legal track than most viewers are used to. These aren't state-level harassment charges. They're federal, filed in the Southern District of Mississippi, which is where the underlying investigation is based. That's part of why a judge could stay his bond and order him transferred across state lines rather than just letting a local court handle it. If convicted, threatening witnesses in an active federal investigation carries serious prison exposure. This is treated as an attack on the justice system itself, not just a private dispute between two people who've never met. Any defense Porter mounts will likely turn on intent and the specifics of what the phone and IP records actually show, since that digital trail is the core of the government's case. Here's where that actually leaves things. The question everyone wants answered, what happened to Nolan Wells on Horn Island, is still sitting behind a sealed evidence file, waiting on a grand jury with no announced timeline. Nothing in this video changes that. What has changed is the shape of the case around it. 3 people, none of them connected to Wells or his friends, are now facing federal charges for threats that came out of public speculation about a case none of them had real information on. And the most serious of those cases, Porter's, has a court date in September that will happen well before anyone expects new movement on the death investigation itself. That timing gap matters, because it means the next real headline in this story probably won't be about Nolan Wells at all. It'll be about whether a man in Illinois goes to federal prison for threats he made based on rumors about a case he had no actual connection to. That's not a satisfying answer. It's also, right now, the honest one. Meanwhile, the family is still doing what families in this position do, pushing for transparency, correcting the record when details like the clothing dispute get distorted, and waiting on a legal process that moves on its own schedule, not the public's. Christine Wansley, Nolan's mother, has continued to speak publicly and has asked the court to formally name her administrator of her son's estate, a procedural step, but one that underscores just how unresolved everything else still is. Quick note before you go. Everything in this video is drawn from court filings and reporting from named news organizations. Anything described as alleged is exactly that, alleged, and unproven in court. As this case develops, especially once the grand jury acts, a lot of what's speculation right now could look very different. If you want to see how this develops, please subscribe to this channel.